be challenged internationally, which in turn will mean periods of instability economically and periods of conflict politically. Now there are some arguments about who was hegemonic at various different points in history, but there is a wide consensus that while there have been hegemonic powers in different parts of the world at different times throughout history, when we're talking about the global system as a whole, there are really only two examples of hegemonic powers. The first is Great Britain. Great Britain, it is argued, became the hegemonic power in the international system at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Prior to that, it was not hegemonic, meaning it was not dominant or not clearly dominant. It competed with numerous other states in the international system, in particular within Europe, most notably France, and to a lesser extent the Netherlands, and so on and so forth. And during this period, prior to the rise of England as the clearly dominant entity in the international system, there were a great number of wars, skirmishes between the various states competing for that dominant position. And so long as there was a great deal of competition between these various states in competition to achieve dominance, you also didn't see free trade. Essentially, mercantilism, in the standard way that I defined in last class, dominated. Each state tried to control their own spheres of influence, their own borders, their own colonial systems, and so on, and to restrict trade as much as possible between areas of the world that they dominated and other areas of the world that they did not. So French colonies did not trade with the British, and the British colonies did not trade with the French. And so on and so forth. Instead, what you had was national empires. And these national empires, whenever they happened to run into conflicts with one another, resulted in various wars. And we saw an awful lot of those wars in the period prior to Napoleon's rise on this continent, primarily between the French and the British, over competition for access to resources in North America, and so on and so forth. Once Britain had become clearly dominant, what we saw instead was a period of relative peace throughout most of the 19th century. There were a few little skirmishes, but certainly nothing compared to what preceded the 19th century, and certainly nothing compared to what followed the 19th century. Great Britain eventually declined as a world power. Its decline was already beginning in the middle of the 19th century, at least its relative decline, insofar as other states started to catch up to Great Britain in their industrial capacities and in their military capacities. But it finally broke down with World War I. A second period of hegemonic rule in the international system was the period since the Second World War, in which the United States became the dominant economic power, the world hegemon. Now, in the case of the 19th century, the features of British hegemony were that, unambiguously, the British pound was the reserve currency of world trade, was the currency through which world trade took place. Since the Second World War, the US dollar has played that role in the international system and continues to do so to this day. Although there are strong signs that this may be changing, which you will start to contemplate as you contemplate your essay assignment later in the coming weeks. The U.S. as a reserve currency, as the currency through which international trade took place and against which all other currencies in the international system were pegged, was itself based on the gold standard, on the convertibility of the US dollar to gold at a standardized rate. The US, in taking on this role, fairly self-consciously in the aftermath of the Second World War, did not only take on that role in being the most powerful economic player and using its dollar as a means of facilitating trade between others, but rather played a much more complex role, akin to that played by Great Britain, but in some ways in a much more complex environment of the 20th century, moving considerably beyond that, of creating the basic institutions through which that system could be stabilized, could be maintained. That basic system through which U.S. hegemony was exercised became known as the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system derives its name from a conference that took place in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt had an estate, a cabin or something of that sort, a retreat, and invited the leaders of the victorious alliance to iron out the institutions that would govern world politics after the defeat of Nazi Germany and Japan. And in that regard, they created three very important institutions, and a fourth that is arguably likewise a crucial component. The first is the U.S. as a reserve currency. The second was the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund. The purpose of the International Monetary Fund is very straightforward: to maintain the stability of the overall trading system globally. And how does it do so? It essentially does so, and I won't go into too many boring details about the International Monetary Fund. As soon as you mention things like International Monetary Fund, people tend to glaze over and lose interest, because it sounds like a boring business topic, although it isn't entirely. The International Monetary Fund functions on the basis that all participants in the global trading system are members of the IMF. And when they become members of the IMF, they pledge to pay their dues to the IMF, which are pegged in accordance to a percentage of their GDP. If any of these member countries at any point find themselves in trouble financially, meaning they don't have enough money to pay their debts, the IMF steps in to lend them the money required to meet their debt obligations. In other words, they can draw, I believe the formula is 10 times their contribution in terms of bailout funds. But that isn't something that happens without a quid pro quo. Meaning that the IMF, when it is called upon to bail out a country, sends its experts into the country to determine what the reasons for the balance of payments problems was, and they in turn make recommendations on how to rectify that situation so that the country does not find itself in trouble again. Meaning that there's always strings attached to the money that the IMF hands out. And the IMF, for that reason, has, on many occasions, become very unpopular. So, for example, when Argentina found itself in deep trouble at the end of the 1990s and went to the IMF to get bailed out, the IMF did bail it out, but what did it ask Argentina to do in order to deal with this problem? Anyone know? Yeah.
Major budget cuts.
Major budget cuts. Why major budget cuts? What can be achieved by major budget cuts?
That's possibly a way.
Usually by decreasing the fiscal policy, because lowering the expenditure part of the fiscal policy to you use compressionary fiscal policy to move by default decreasing inflation? Because there's less spending in the economy.
Okay, I think you're right on the money. Essentially, for those of you that didn't quite hear that, let me repeat that and put it in my own terms. But essentially, the way that it works is that if you have a balance of payments deficit, in other words, you can't pay your debts, it's probably because you've been exporting less than you've been importing, and therefore gotten yourself further and further into debt. The solution to that is to export more, import less. How do you export more? Well, the only way that you can export more is by making your exports more attractive on global markets. And how do you do that? By lowering the expense of those goods. And how do you lower the expense of those goods? Well, you do so, or you can do so in a number of different ways, one of which is to push down wages. Pushing down wages in relatively poor countries tends not to be very popular for obvious reasons. Another way is to lower other expenses, such as tax burdens. Tax burdens are paid by everyone, and insofar as the taxes are very high, they raise the cost of domestic products. And if you cut those taxes, it makes those goods cheaper on international markets, and therefore sell more. But in order to cut taxes, you also have to cut spending domestically. The IMF generally opposes these kinds of policies, and given that the countries that find themselves in deficit of payment problems predominantly are relatively poor countries in the third world, these ideas of austerity being imposed in order to drastically lower the expenses or the cost of products from these poor countries obviously meets with some resistance. The second institution that the U.S. along with its allies, primarily the U.S., created as a result of, or in the Bretton Woods conference was the World Bank. The World Bank was first and foremost known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD. In large part because its initial purpose was to facilitate the rapid reconstruction of Western Europe after the destruction of World War II. But its scope increased from that as Europe became more stabilized to become a key institution in facilitating the development of much of the rest of the world. How does it do so? It provides loans to third world countries or to countries in need of development or reconstruction. But it does so in a way that's different from how banks usually do so. Banks lend money, indeed that's their business, but they do so at an interest rate that is determined by the global predominant rate of profit, to make a long story short. In other words, they do so in order to make money. The World Bank presumably does not. The World Bank does so in order to facilitate the development of these countries, and therefore the interest rates of World Bank loans generally tend to be lower than those of banks. They lend to states, not to private individuals. And again, for that reason perhaps, are also inclined to charge less in the way of interest. Now that might strike you as a little bit odd, and certainly from the point of view of U.S. policymakers, the idea of creating a World Bank to lend money to states so that they can start to develop their country smacked of socialism. States are going to be the main agents of development, and they're going to be loaned money and will make the decisions on how to invest that money. That's essentially what socialism is, or at least in the eyes of American policymakers. And they certainly weren't interested in creating socialist order in developing countries. Meaning that the World Bank, in order to serve the interests of the United States, has a fairly strict mandate in terms of its lending policies, not to lend money at the expense of banks. Meaning for a particular country in the developed world to get a World Bank to complete some kind of a project, they first have to demonstrate A, that project is absolutely required for their continued development, and B, that they cannot find a private lender to provide the money for them. So the World Bank is not supposed to compete with private lenders. Essentially what it therefore does is that it lends money essentially for those kinds of things that private lenders are not going to lend money for because they're not profitable. And things like that would be power installations, ports, roads, highway systems, and so on, that are prerequisites to a solid functioning of the developing economy, maybe prerequisites toward building export-oriented businesses and so on, in the case of ports. But they nonetheless are loans, and those loans eventually have to be repaid, and even though the interest is lower than market rates, they nonetheless result in an eventual withdrawal of resources from those markets. The third major institution was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which has since become the World Trade Organization. And that goes to the heart of the liberal trade system, in that the aim of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was to the greatest extent possible to eliminate any kind of restrictions on trade in the international system. The main limits on trade in the international system come in the form of tariffs. In other words, fees that countries impose when somebody is importing a particular good. And the reason for those tariffs, in some cases, is simply to raise tax revenues for the state, but more often is to protect domestic industries that can't compete with external producers of similar products. GATT has, and the World Trade Organization, as we will see as we move forward in our discussions of international political economy, have relaxed global trade significantly. As such, we today talk about globalization, which essentially refers to the free flow of goods and services across national boundaries throughout the globe. Again, that is not entirely the case, in that even the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as it was first applied to Western Europe, for example, made certain exemptions to what kind of tariffs were acceptable, so that the Europeans, among other things, were able to continue to protect their domestic agricultural producers, and so on. And of course, the United States is not free of protectionist measures, as Canadians are well aware, with the softwood lumber dispute between Canada and the United States having lasted for almost 20 years in the 1990s and the first decade of this century. The United States does, on occasion, also impose tariffs in order to protect domestic producers of goods that are considered to be important. The final institution was the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which was a forum through which global policy could be made that included the most developed countries, the G6, that eventually became the G7, that eventually became the G8, and that in the meantime is more or less the G20, depending on who exactly is included. Now, why did Great Britain become a hegemon? And why did the United States become a hegemon? And why did the United States not become a hegemon earlier on? Let me talk a little bit about these historical aspects of things. The general argument with regard to hegemonic stability theory is essentially that prior to Great Britain's rise at the beginning of the 19th century, there were no clear global hegemons, and consequently a great deal of conflict and a great deal of instability. Some historians argue that to a slightly lesser extent than in the case of Britain, the Netherlands played the role of a hegemon for a brief period in the 17th century. I am not enough of a historian to pass judgment on that. However, that seems to be a minority position in the literature overall. But the reality is that by the middle of the 19th century, Britain was, at least in relative terms, already in decline economically. But nonetheless continued to play that role of stabilizing world trade, of facilitating world trade through the use of the British pound, and so on and so forth. It became less of a dominant player, not so much because of its absolute decline, but because of its relative decline when compared to other powers in the international system. And here, the most important are Germany and the United States, both of which were developing rather rapidly after the 1860s in the aftermath of the Civil War in the case of the United States, and in the aftermath of the unification of Germany in the early 1870s in the case of Germany. As these countries grew rapidly, they also increasingly ran up against interests that the British were able to support so long as they were hegemonic, resulting in greater and greater conflict, and ultimately culminating in World War I. When no individual state is dominant, those individual states are, as they compete against each other, first and foremost, are not going to participate in a liberal open trading system. In other words, as they start to focus on each other in terms of competition, the idea that everyone benefits from world trade becomes less important than that some states benefit from it more than others. And therefore, states will start to try to figure out ways of restricting trade that allow them to benefit to a greater extent than their competitors. Free trade begins to break down in favor of more nationalistic kinds of policies. In other words, after the 1870s, the United States imposed serious restrictions on trade in order to facilitate its own industrialization, and therefore in order to become economically more powerful. Germany did likewise. As they protected their own domestic markets, the British certainly followed suit and protected its domestic markets against the products being offered by Germany and the United States. And thus you saw increasing competition. And while the competition between Great Britain and the United States did not lead to war, the competition between Germany and Great Britain certainly did, leading to a period of instability. Now, Germany, as you know, was defeated in World War I for complex reasons that I won't bore you with at the moment. But suffice it to say, despite the fact that Germany, by the 19th century, had eclipsed Great Britain as the biggest industrial producer on the planet, alongside with the United States, neither Germany or the United States took on the role of being a global hegemon. Germany couldn't because it had been defeated in the First World War. Its economy had been largely crippled. It had been forced to convert to democracy, which ended up being extremely unstable and eventually led to the rise of the Nazis and so on and so forth. The United States probably could have, and many argue should have, stepped into the role that had been abandoned by Great Britain. But in the aftermath of the First World War, ultimately did not. And it's an interesting question why it did not. Certainly, elements within the United States, especially those represented by the President of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson, saw their role as becoming the new global hegemon. Woodrow Wilson, you might recall, entered the First World War with lofty ambitions of making the world safe for democracy, making it the war to end all wars, creating complex institutions to make sure that that happens, like the League of Nations, of which the United States would be the main champion. Showing all the signs that the United States was ready to step into the role that had been abandoned out of necessity by Great Britain. It ultimately did not do so. And one reason for that is, well, reasons are somewhat complicated. The first reason has to do with economics. And again, there we get into some pretty complex theoretical discussions about the relationship between economics and the state, and why the state does what it does. Suffice it to say, as Jeffrey Friedman in a very good article argued back in the 1980s, that the dominant economic groups in the United States, those that had the greatest economic clout, that employed the most people, and so on, still were very much wedded to producing for the domestic market in the United States. Their main source of revenue, their main source of profit was the domestic market. And insofar as they looked at the international economy, they looked at the international economy mostly as a competitor within that domestic market, and sought to protect their profits by re-erecting tariff barriers In other words, continuing the protectionist measures that had been adopted after the 1870s. And for that reason, certainly we're not interested at that point in global free trade. They represented the majority and certainly the most powerful groups within the American economy, but not all of them. Certain industries were already very much behind Woodrow Wilson in his attempt to impose global free trade and for the United States to play a more dominant role. In particular, those industries were the banking industry that had started to invest globally as opposed to exclusively in the United States, and mining industries, which had established mining operations throughout Latin America, throughout much of the rest of the third world. But in the conflict between these two different groups in Congress, ultimately the former groups won out and reimposed protectionism. The other side of it has to do with perceptions within the United States overall. One of the things that defines American foreign policy, and has done since the beginning of the inception of the United States, was a famous speech given by George Washington, his farewell address when he left office. And in that farewell address that's often cited to this day, George Washington warned his successors to stay out of foreign entanglements. To stay out of foreign entanglements. He argued that foreign entanglements will screw everything up in the experiment of democracy that was the U.S. at the end of his administration. They'll screw everything up in large part because the American system of government is based on a system of separation of powers in which Congress, the executive, and the judiciary are co-equal branches that are meant to keep each other in check, that are meant to keep each other under control, meaning that the limits imposed by the Bill of Rights were not imposed because everyone expected that since it's written down in the Constitution, everyone will observe it, but rather because insofar as the executive branch tried to violate those basic limits on government, the legislative branch would step in his way and say, no, you can't do that. Insofar as the legislative branch tried to do so, the president had the power to veto what the legislative branch was up to. Insofar as either of them did so together, the judiciary was the final check on that. Washington argued essentially that by the United States becoming more entangled in foreign affairs, necessarily more and more power would shift to the executive branch, because the executive branch, the president, deals with foreign affairs, and would therefore undermine that system of checks and balances and make the United States less democratic. Furthermore, it would shift more and more power toward the federal government and away from the states, and therefore again undermine the basic balance of federalism within the American system. And furthermore, and perhaps most importantly, he argued, foreign entanglements, by which he meant alliances, will invariably pull the United States into global conflicts in which the U.S. has no interest. Because that's what global entanglements are, according to Washington. They are alliances. And when you are allied with a foreign country, you practice a form of collective security, meaning that if somebody attacks your ally, you are bound by that alliance to come to that ally's aid, whether it's in your interest to do so or not. And the U.S., therefore, resorted to what many historians describe as isolationism throughout the 19th century, which is highly misleading because the United States actually was pretty actively involved in trade globally, and all sorts of things globally. A more accurate description is that the United States tended toward unilateralism. In other words, it tended to act on its own rather than in the context of an alliance system like that warned against by Washington. Well, the question therefore became, what is the League of Nations? While the supporters of Woodrow Wilson argued that the League of Nations was a means by which the United States could bypass the traditional means of managing international affairs through diplomacy and balance of power and alliances and so on and so forth, and create a system of, as Woodrow Wilson himself described it, open covenants openly arrived at. His opponents saw it as the exact opposite, as precisely the kind of foreign entanglement against which Washington had warned, and precisely the kind of foreign entanglement that would drag the United States into conflicts in which it had no interest whatsoever. And there's something to that. A cornerstone of the League of Nations system was the idea of collective security. And the idea of collective security rested on the notion that if any member of the League of Nations